All right, joining us now is Rice Hadley Gates co-founder and partner Anja Manuel and former Deputy U.S. Trade Representative Robert Holliman joining us from Washington, D.C. Anja, I'd like to start with you. After we heard from our own Eric Schatzker talking about what we might expect, what we might hope for out of the Xi-Trump meeting, what would be some kind of success that we might keep within our level of expectation?
All right, thank you for having me. I think success and a so-called deal would be three things. One, that the basic parameters for a negotiation between China and the U.S. and trade are there. What are we going to talk about? What's a basic timeline? That's one. Two, that especially on the U.S. side, it's clear who is going to be doing the negotiating and who actually speaks for the president. That's been very unclear. At times, it's been Peter Navarro putting himself forward, of course, a famous China hawk. At other times, it seems like the Treasury Secretary Mnuchin or Larry Kudlow are speaking for the administration. So we need some clarity on who's doing that. And I think if we can get both those things, hopefully that there'll be a backing off on the new tariffs, or at least no further tariffs imposed. That's what we can hope for. All right,
Robert Holliman, let me bring you in here. If China and the U.S. were to designate a couple folks to speak on behalf of Xi Jinping and Donald Trump, who might those be? Who would you like them to be?
Well, ultimately, we've learned in this relationship that it has to be President Trump and it has to be President Xi Jinping. They won't be negotiating tariff line by tariff line, but they are, and certainly for this administration, the U.S. has made it quite clear there is one person who's ultimately able to do it. Traditionally, trade issues are dealt with by the United States Trade Representative, and I think Ambassador Lighthizer, who's part of the White House, is an ideal person to do that. I think the key, though, is there enough parameters around the type of changes that fundamentally need to be made in China for us to move forward? And I think we'll see a precursor to that in the broader G20 discussions about the future of trade and the future of the World Trade Organization. That's the effort the global community can help set the stage for a more productive one-on-one discussion when that happens between the U.S. and China.
Robert, I think that's the crux of it, isn't it? What counts as a deliverable? We know that President Trump likes deliverables. He wants things that can be kind of wrapped up as a win, if you will, going away from events like the G20. But some of the things that the US have demanded, structural economic change in China, essentially pretty massive changes to the Made in China 2025 tech ambitions. We know that they're probably non-negotiable or even non-deliverable in terms of being able to happen in the short term, right?
That's absolutely correct. I think the best deliverable we can hope for the bilateral is an agreement in principle about engagement in the coming months to determine if they can bridge the difference. But before we get to that, we have a fundamental question. Can the G20 as a whole develop a common statement around trade and the future of the World Trade Organization? And that really is also critical because we saw at APEC, the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, 10 days ago, that there was not an agreement for the first time in the 29-year history. So the G20 has an essential role to play to say that there is a future for the World Trade Organization, and that needs to include looking at the things in the WTO that work, like innovation, protection of intellectual property. We need that strong reaffirmation of the system to set the stage for the longer-term discussions between the United States and China and other countries.
And as these longer-term discussions may or may not happen, I think we've agreed that the best case scenario is that we get sort of some niceties and a framework for more discussions to come. The likes of the IMF is warning that the world economy may already be slowing more than what we know. Is there already damage that's being done and will continue to be done in terms of a loss of investment confidence by companies, in terms of a diversion and chaos when it comes to supply chains? All of that goes on while the US and China continues to have these on and off conversations about trade.
There is absolutely damage being done. You saw General Motors shutter some plants this week. That may have had a little bit to do with how much more expensive it now is to get steel and aluminum because of the tariffs and the retaliation on the tariffs. When I talk to business leaders across the United States, whether it's semiconductors to soybeans, they are worried, and I've never seen business leaders so united in wanting to resolve the problems between China and the U.S. on trade and get back to business as normal. Having said that, I would add that the unfair trade practices that China has been practicing for many years now are real. And I don't think it's too much to ask to stop the cyber theft of intellectual property, both in the United States, Chinese stealing from U.S. and European and other companies. It is not too much to ask to do reasonable opening of their markets and let foreign firms compete in an appropriate way. So those are all the things that really need to be on the table. This isn't really, when you get down to it, about trade deficits, although the president often says that. It's really about fair market access. And I think if we have a united front between the U.S., Europe, Japan, Australia, we can hopefully get China to see some reason.
Anja, I have to say that with the current administration, they are not want to reach out and work with other folks around the world, as we know. But more to your point about imports and exports. Hop into the Bloomberg terminal with me. This is in the GTV library, and I just want to get us up to speed with where we are right now in terms of those tariffs. That's the yellow line here. The red line would be tariffs across all of U.S. imports from China here. But in terms of the hurt, Anja, for the U.S. as well as China, for their GDP. We know that China is not doing well. The U.S. also is set to slow down. How much hurt could we actually see if this affected all the imports?
There are various studies on this. One I saw out just yesterday that I think is funded by conservatives in the United States says if all of these tariffs are implemented, all of the ones we're currently discussing, you would have a loss of 360 billion or more of GDP in the United States next year, and something similar or even higher in China. And the rest of the world actually does a little bit better because they gain from the fact that these two giants are warring. I mean, you look at our soybean farmers here in the U.S. are hurting. Soybean prices are down by 20%, and the Brazilians are laughing all the way to the bank because, of course, the Chinese are buying from them.
Robert, I'm just wondering, having been in the position of Deputy USTR, how much of this strikes you as being based on obvious economic grievances that exist, but how much of it do you think is also being informed by overtures of an ideological battle with Beijing?
I think it's really is largely being driven by actual problems that exist. There is a long history of the United States having challenges related to China. Those challenges are virtually never unique to the United States, but it is how the United States has approached those, whether they were issues around intellectual property protection in the George H.W. Bush administration, the prospects in the Clinton administration of bringing China into the WTO with the hopes that they'd become a market economy, to efforts in the George W. Bush and certainly in the Obama administration to correct the imbalances. One of the important things in this is that the U.S. is leading, and the U.S. is probably paying the price for the leadership to try to make these changes. But everything that the U.S. has identified as a problem with China having a restrictive economy, its lack of respect for intellectual property, for forcing joint ventures, that applies to every other country in the world. And that's why the solution will never be one that is solely struck by the U.S. and China. It has to also figure out how the WTO is modernized, it's reformed to deal with a large economy like China that's a non-market driven economy, how it increases transparency around the rules-based system, and how it addresses some of the shortcomings in the appellate body. So we have to instill greater confidence that there is a global mechanism to deal with it. The U.S. is the pointy end of the spear. This ultimately has to be resolved by the U.S. and China, but it has to be a resolution that works well for the U.S. and all of our trading partners. So this is really an interesting game, interesting play. It is two leaders, but they are effectively proxies for a larger global challenge that's playing out in the G20.
Robert, thank you so much for that. Rice Hadley Gates co-founder and partner Anja Manuel joining us there with the former US Deputy Trade Representative Ambassador Robert Holliman as well. Great to have you both in this conversation. I always look ahead to the weekend's